Couple of weeks since we had an opportunity to catch up with the way the world is changing.
Yes.
And more and more seems to happen every week. In fact, the change still seems to be accelerating. And I have to say that I don't think it's in America's favor. Several things seem to have happened in the last few days that deserve mention that makes it appear to me as though Kerry and presumably Obama are trying to hold on to things the way they have been, whereas China and Merkel and I'm not sure about Cameron and various other people are pushing ahead without much attention to what the Americans want. There was a meeting between China and Japan and the US somewhere out in Asia recently, and the last couple of days it's reported in the news that I read this morning that it was almost an open argument between China and the US over what's going on in the South China Sea, as though the US could actually continue to control the seas around China, and they may want to, and they may not like what China is doing, but I don't see there's any way they can control it. And I think that the last thing that Obama wants to do is to become Abe's Japanese active ally in some sort of confrontation with China. So it seems strange to me that they would be handling it in this way. And then I just noticed that Merkel has cancelled an agreement with Verizon over internal communications in Germany.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Simply because, well, I think it's just come up, simply because of what happened with Snowden.
Uh-huh.
And then, of course, there's what's going on in Syria and Iraq, in which the American interests seem to be losing ground all the time. Actually, Iran's interests are losing ground as well, and it's not clear what Iran is going to do. Although I have to say, I think that what Kerry calls ISIL and what everybody else calls ISIS I think it's only a passing phase. I don't think that they're going to be supported by a large population in either country for very long. It's just reactions against the current governments that's giving them support at the moment. Because nobody seems to think they have more than 10,000 people, and 10,000 people won't be able to control a large area for very long.
No, I think that's true. I think a couple of things come to mind in response to what you said. First of all, when I was in London this past week, and there was quite a lot of press coverage, deep, well thought out pieces about the centennial anniversary of the start of World War One. Essentially framing it as the war that, when it ended, drew the maps of today.
And that seems not to be getting much attention in this country, but a lot of attention in Europe. You know?
Yeah. And I mean, the fact of the matter remains that in 1919, at one of the several conferences in Versailles, those 5 or 6 agreements that composed the whole agreement overall, that's when the map of Iraq was drawn up. All right, that's, as we know, that's when this group of Shia, Sunni, and Kurds were put together into this one administrative unit. So now what's happening is less than 100 years from 1919, it seems to be breaking apart, which, as we know, 100 years is a speck of time in the specter of history. That's number one. The second thing I noticed, and this was in the American press, is that the Iranians, apparently right after September 11th, informed then President Bush that they were willing to provide him any support he needed against the Taliban. And in fact, we're providing him with bombing coordinate suggestions and various other military intelligence information. And then, of course, the third thing we see now, as I commented to a few people in London last week, is the specter of, I'm sure it's happened already, some sort of unofficial discussion between the Pentagon and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard people, just to make sure that we don't step on each other in this critical upcoming battle for Baghdad. And this is amazing that we're seeing some sort of military cooperation between two countries like this, where we're still having difficulty even getting to the nuclear arms agreement.
I hope Congress knows about it.
Oh, that's another thing entirely. Yeah, I mean, which goes to
No,
one
I
of
think
that goes to one of the points that
Congress,
you make all the time.
other
How
things
can you
behind the
possibly
scenes.
govern if you have to take care of those 535 people?
Yeah, I think Obama's doing a lot of things behind the scenes which are forward-looking, but has terrible difficulty with public opinion in this country as represented by Congress, and that's what's causing a lot of trouble. But it's interesting, I think, that Sykes and Picot and other people who were involved in making the decisions about what to do with the Ottoman Empire after 1918 thought that the way to do it was to put what was to balance different interests in each territorial unit.
Well, they certainly succeeded in that, and the balance, as we've seen with people like Stalin and Tito and other people, that balance can only work if there's an iron fist at the top of the food chain.
And it's true that it did have something to do with the boundaries that they inherited, the boundaries of the Ottoman provinces. However, they put three provinces together in Iraq, and they separated Lebanon from the rest of Syria.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Lebanon, of course, has had problems for 50 years now,
Mm-hmm.
and Syria's problems have only just begun. But it seems to me that the way the problems have developed is very much the result of the acceleration of the processes of globalization. More and more people in each country becoming involved in thinking about what's happening in the country as a whole, and the level of awareness rising, more and more people participating.
Well,
That's what's causing the trouble, and nobody quite knows what to do about it yet.
Well, I've been waiting for somebody, some person, whether it be Obama or Kerry or Cameron or somebody in Iraq, just to stand up and say, well, wait a minute, we've only had this condition for 95 years. Why don't we go back to the way it was and set up three separate countries? Now, I know that leads to a whole bunch of problems. Now, all of a sudden, there'll be another Shia state immediately adjoining Iran, all right, which is not a helpful thing. It automatically means that there'll be a Sunni state sitting next to the Shia state, which is not necessarily a good thing. I think the Kurds are probably fine, although I don't know, we'd have to call the Turks about that. But, I mean, they seem to not have any particular geographical ambitions beyond their own area.
Well, the problem with what you suggest, which seems the obvious thing to do, is that there's going to be trouble whatever you try to do, because not everybody agrees with what should be done.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the most important thing is that the people work it out for themselves. But because of what's happened so far, the process that they might be able to get involved in of working it out for themselves is going to be very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it would certainly be easy for Iran to become more involved with Maliki and the Shia, if America stepped aside, the problem of the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the Sunni part of Iraq would be much more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And Saudi Arabia anyway is beginning to have more and more internal problems over its succession.
Correct. It occurs to me, I mean, Lebanon, which aside from the instability, which probably has been more unstable than it's been stable, but for a long time it was stable, has that sort of tripartite power arrangement between the Shia, the Sunni, and the Christians, where one member is a Speaker of the House, another member is the President, the other member is the Prime Minister, and that's always, I mean, it might even be codified in their Constitution, I don't know.
It is.
So, I mean, something like that could perhaps theoretically work in Iraq. I don't know, but I think the way it stands right now is absent some sort of dictatorial kind of control that would be anathema to the West, or at least certainly to the families of the American and British service members who lost their lives in Iraq. I don't know that there's any other way to do anything.
Well, it's interesting that 100 years ago there was talk of the Sunnis accepting the Shia as the fifth school of Islam, along with the Malikis, Hanafi, and so on,
Really?
the four orthodox schools of Sunni Islam. So it's not as though this has been a growing problem. It's something that has broken down, a possible coming together that has broken down in the last half century as a result, I think, of foreign interference. And I think that what the processes of globalization are showing us is that having spent the last 200 years in activities which have favored the idea of big imperial powers controlling large areas of the world, and in so doing increasing the amount of interaction between different parts of the world, and spreading knowledge, spreading technology, and so on. Starting with the end of the colonial period in the middle of the last century, there's been an accelerating process of in every part of the world of dissatisfaction with any sort of foreign interference. And another thing that I noticed that's similar to this in the news, in the recent Economist, I think, or a recent Economist, was that the Chinese are now developing the same ideas about the Chinese language as the French were developing as long as 40 years ago. That is, they don't want foreign loan words. They don't want.
Oh, really?
They don't want cheap. They want people to write in Chinese characters, and they want them to write Chinese words, not to somehow try to signify YouTube and email and things like that.
So
it's very interesting that the Chinese should now be worried about that. But it all has to do with this idea that everything has to come from the local awareness, and then negotiate with what's beyond, but not. There's a increasing dissatisfaction with anything that seems to be the imposition of other values from outside.
I agree with that, but let's look specifically at a case. Let's look at Iraq. You've spent a lot of time in Iraq. You've spent time amongst the Shia and the Sunni, and I'm sure you've spent time amongst the Kurds. I mean, would you hazard a guess as to what the local on the ground thoughts are? I mean, is there a desire to have a unified country with those three component parts as written in 1919, or is there a desire to split into three separate countries?
Well, although the Shia have been very much aware of the fact that they're all Shia for a long time, simply because they were an underclass,
right,
for much of the last millennium or more. The Kurds never thought of themselves as one people until very recently. I mean, maybe that awareness began at the end of the 19th century, but was not comprehensive for all the Kurds until much later. And the Sunni in Iraq, similarly, just have always thought of themselves as Sunni and therefore part of the larger Islamic community, but not forming one Iraqi Sunni community.
Correct.
And it's partly for that reason that ISIL or ISIS has been so successful, I think, that they have reacted, they've come gradually in the last half dozen years to react more and more strongly against being dominated by Shia because of Maliki's policies and the way he's chosen his government. But they don't have this sense of being an integrated community on equal terms with the Shia to the south of them and the Kurds to the north of them. That awareness is developed more easily among the Kurds because of the fact that they're surrounded by people who are against it, and that fosters it.
Okay.
The Turks to the north, and the Iranians to the east, and I think that they definitely want to be left alone by the Arabs. They've got their own language and their own ideas about how society should work. But with the Sunnis, it's much more complicated because they're divided into they have different tribal allegiances, and there's never been anything historically that's given them the sense of being all belonging to one community.
Now, did I read that the Saudis are supporting ISIS?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do they perhaps have any sway over them?
As far as we know. The thing is that the Saudis will do anything to support anything that's against Iran.
Right, right.
Which is in itself paradoxical because the Saudis don't represent any sort of historical interests that are against Iran. It's very much a modern interest that has developed mainly since the middle of the last century because of the ambitions of the Shah.
Oh, yes.
It got worse because of the fact that Khomeini got such good press coverage throughout the Islamic world because it's the first revolution from below.
Right, right. You know, all of this makes what's going on in the Ukraine seem almost very easily solved. I saw that Kerry today said Putin has only a matter of hours to agree to withdraw the troops from the border.
And still nobody says anything about the history behind this.
No, it's unbelievable. I mean, it's you know, and it's funny. The Europeans know. I mean, when I happened to be speaking to a group of people in London this past week, there's nobody over there who's fooled. They're like, we don't quite. And these are British. I mean, Albion. I mean, the remote island and everything. But I'm sure if you move into the continent itself, people are like, I don't understand this. I mean, the Ukraine is historically part of Russia.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the Bolshoi is performing in America.
Oh, they're here. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
We just saw them in Washington, and we're going to go see them in New York in July.
Oh, good for you. Good for you. Well, we'll reconvene, I guess, next week and see where we end up and see if John Kerry's 3 hours to Putin and where ISIS is at that point in the Baghdad suburbs or closer, and go from there.
I think we can be sure that a lot more is going to happen in the coming week. I look forward to talking to you.
Thank you, Brian. Have a good week.
Bye.